Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Literature Channel. I'm Tim Wilson. This is the third of three lectures on the history of literary theory. Today, we're covering neoclassical and romantic literary theories, specifically Sidney, Pope, and Wordsworth. So let's get started. First of all, Sidney's defense of poetry. So this is a, a, a very important work of the English Renaissance, written in the late 16th century, the Elizabethan era. I have other lectures on Renaissance literature and Sidney that go into more depth on these things, but for the purposes of the history of literary theory, let's look at his defense of poetry, which really helped fuel a, a an artistic movement in the 1590s. Really, his let's say context of writing that defense, this essay defending poetry, is the context of where we began with these lectures in the history of literary theory, Plato's critique of poetry in the Republic. So if we remind ourselves, for Plato, art and truth, or poetry and philosophy, are intention or quarrel. And the Renaissance, beginning with figures such as Sidney, saw a certain synthesis of the two. So, again, a reminder, Socrates provides a moral critique of poetry in books 2 and 3. And then in book 10, he provides a metaphysical critique in terms of where poetry for Socrates would sit within a certain hierarchy of, of metaphysical realities. So we have the, let's say, the form of bedness, for example, that would be created by God, would be the highest truth of what it means to be a bed. And then a bed maker, in turn, makes a particular bed as a reflection of that. And the artist or the poet creates an image of a particular bed. So they're twice removed from the truth of bedness. In his defense of poesy, Sir Philip Sidney defends poetry against puritanical attacks, such as Stephen Gosson's The School of Abuse. So he's responding in the first instance to contemporary, let's say, popular discussion at the time, but his deeper philosophical, let's say, counterpoint is Plato's Republic. That's the deep conversation that's going on for the more enlightened reader. He's defending poetry against the critiques that we just reminded ourselves of in Plato's Republic. He calls into question Plato's point of departure that art and poetry represent a pre-existing reality. This is the fundamental point. And actually, interestingly enough, I did a chapter of my dissertation years, over 30 years ago now, on on Sidney's defense of poetry, and it was around this notion of representation in art and literature. Is representation the only thing that art and literature do? And I think with Sidney, we get this sense that no, art is not just representing a pre-existing particular physical reality. Sidney's then able to call into question, because of this, the metaphysical and moral charges against poetry. So in this way, Sidney gives voice to a general Renaissance privileging of art as the founding of a new world, not the sterile repetition of that which is. And poetry for Sidney is the highest knowledge, he says. All other knowledges are tied to the world as it is, whereas poetry is not. And to quote Sidney, only the poet, disdaining to be tied to any such subjection, lifted up with the vigor of his own invention, doth grow in effect another nature, in making things either better than nature bringeth forth, or quite anew, forms such as never were in nature, as the heroes, demigods, cyclops, chimeras, furies, and such like. So as he goeth hand in hand with nature, not enclosed within the narrow warrant of her gifts, but freely ranging only within the zodiac of his own wit. So the poet does not represent the particular bed. Rather, the poet brings forth other possibilities out of the nature of bedness, out of the ideal. The poet brings forth this ideal into a poetic image. Again, to quote Sidney, and I'll just pause there. Sidney's a beautiful writer, both in poetry and prose. So I highly encourage you to read the essay just to get a sense of the richness that is possible in early modern Renaissance prose. They're picking up rhetorical strategies from the classics, and they're excited about these rhetorical strategies that are being rediscovered in the Renaissance, and Sidney is a master at it. And so I invite you to read the essay itself, even just for the prose as well as for the concepts we're going through here. So again, Sidney's quote here: "Nature never set forth the earth in so rich tapestry as diverse poets have done, neither with so pleasant rivers, fruitful trees, sweet-smelling flowers, nor whatsoever else may make the too much loved earth more lovely. Her world is brazen, the poets only deliver a golden." Certainly, Sidney says what many people refer to as art is nothing but this type of mirroring that Plato talks about. This is the art, for instance, of what he calls the second type of poet, quote, "who counterfeit only such faces as are set before them." True poets, though, according to Sidney, imitate the ideal and bring it forth. They, quote, "do imitate to teach and delight, and to imitate borrow nothing of what is, hath been, or shall be, but range only reigned with learned discretion into the divine consideration of what may be and should be." So there's this sense then for Sidney that the poets bringing forth a different sense of the truth that may not be manifest in the physical world and bringing it forth in the shiny poetic image. And he uses examples from Virgil, bringing forth the truth of piety in the form of Aeneas, or or the and that's a great example, I think, or bringing forth in the poetic image of Lucrece, the poets bringing forth certain virtues of chastity and loyalty. So poetry is superior to philosophy and history, according to Sidney, and he's building on this point from Aristotle at this point. The quote, "ending end of all earthly learning being virtuous action, the poet is the one who most fully brings forth the nature of virtue and moves us to act upon it." According to Sidney, it is not the moral philosopher that is able to guide us out of the cave. The moral philosopher knows virtue. He or she has seen the truth outside the cave, but he or she cannot speak to those who are still inside the cave. Their dialectical knowledge, so the knowledge of these philosophers who may have transcended the cave, it has to be married to a poetic rhetorical delivery. Their philosophic madness must be mixed with an earthly wisdom, or their theoretical virtues must be given the emotive power of the poetic figure. Only in this way are we who are in the cave moved to act according to these ideals. Nor can the historian teach us virtue. The historian is tied to the realm of physical change and fortune, the shadows and stick figures within the cave. Only the poet, says Sidney, by bringing forth the ideal into a second nature, is able to bring together the ideal or essential and the realm of the image or the changeable. In sum, over against the historian, the poet presents what should be, not what is. Over against the philosopher, the poet moves us to this should, this ideal. Sidney's a devout Protestant, but he still asserts the need for literary obscurity as a way to protect sacred truth from the herd. This is towards the end of the essay. He says, "To believe with me that there are many mysteries contained in poetry which of purpose were written darkly, lest by profane wits it should be abused." Now, here he's referring to a practice of esoteric writing. And I have a whole course on esoteric literature, but a series of of lectures introducing the concept of esoteric literature. I'll put a link in the description, and fascinating field if you want to check that out further. So let's turn now, a little over a century later, Alexander Pope's An Essay on Criticism. So this Alexander Pope is really defining the neoclassical aesthetic. So sometimes the Renaissance is lumped into this broad category of neoclassical because they're turning to the classics, but in a strict sense of late 18th late 17th century, early 18th century aesthetics where they're developing rules of decorum based on Horace, based on Aristotle. Pope and French counterparts are the neoclassical aesthetic. So let's start with a quote early on from this essay on criticism from 1711. First follow nature and your judgment frame by her just standard, which is still the same, unerring nature still divinely bright, one clear, unchanged, and universal light. Life, force, and beauty must to all impart, at once the source, and end and test of art. So this is a quintessential statement of neoclassical aesthetics, reflecting the core tenets of order, reason, classical authority. So neoclassicism sided with the ancients in the late 17th, early 18th century quarrel of ancients and moderns. So there's this quarrel of ancients who felt in order to write well, whether it's literature, but also in other endeavors, we need to follow the rules of the ancients. They had it all figured out. So these classical authors provide the generic forms, they provide the types by which we should adhere to. And then there are others, there are moderns that said, well, they had a good start, but we've built on their shoulders and we can see further now. And they said, we should move on and we can create new forms of knowledge, new forms of literary endeavor. So the side of the moderns needed to argue against the stance of the neoclassical aesthetics. And for them, for the moderns, there's not an enduring natural standard of beauty and moral achievement that was originally discovered by the ancients. In this way, this quarrel in a way leads to what is called the second wave of modernity by Leo Strauss. So I have a number of lectures on that as well, on the three waves of modernity as a whole, but also in particular on the second wave of modernity, which ushers in Romanticism in the 19th century. So I'll leave a link in the description to that. So back to Pope, the rationality of nature, very important for neoclassical aesthetics. So in this era, influenced by the Enlightenment and thinkers such as Isaac Newton, they see the universe as this perfect rational machine created by a reasonable God. Unerring nature, in the quote we read, it's just standard and universal light. They're all terms that define nature not as this wild landscape, and the notion of nature as a wild landscape we'll see with the romantic view later, but it's a fixed system of harmonious laws and truths. So Pope asserts that this ordered, accessible reality is the ultimate standard for human creation. This contrasts with the romantic focus on individual emotion or the sublime, terrifying aspects of nature. So the other key point here, in addition to the fact that nature provides us with ordered principles, rational rules, is the adherence to classical authority, and this adherence to the rules both of nature and classical authority kind of all gets bundled under this notion of decorum. We get it starting with Horace, and the neoclassical writers pick up on Horace's claim there. The lines establish that true art is not innovation, but imitation of the perfect natural order. The function of the poet is to adhere to the pre-existing model, the emphasis on the standard being still the same and unchanged, rejects originality in favor of decorum, propriety, or fitness of style and established rules. So he, and, and we'll continue here in the same vein, the rules of art are not arbitrary restrictions, but are simply nature observed and codified. This fusion of the natural world and rational structure is the hallmark of neoclassicism. So, another quote from the first part of the essay: those rules of old, discovered, not devised, are nature still, but nature methodized. Nature, like liberty, is but restrained by the same laws which first herself ordained. So, there's a lot going on in this quote. So the rules of literary composition from Aristotle and Horace and these things are not are not devised by them and invented by them, and then we can invent new ones in a different age. These are discovered from nature. They're part of an enduring natural order. And these rules are nature still, but nature methodized, put into a particular prescription for the author to follow. And by following these rules, this is the last two lines of this, it is not as though following the rules is a limit on one's freedom, because true liberty is needs some constraint. So there's a distinction, famous distinction made by a number of key thinkers between, let's call it freedom from, let's say a freedom from restraint, say license. Thinking of liberty in that vein as freedom from restraint versus freedom to or freedom for, the freedom to fulfill one's end. Now, this is an important distinction for the neoclassicists, but the whole classical tradition from Plato on to up to Pope and the authors of the 18th century. Now, the Romantics, as we'll see when we turn to Wordsworth, see generic form and the rules imposed by the classical tradition as a straitjacket, as not allowing poetic license, so to speak. So they begin to see liberty as needing to be without restraint. They see liberty as freedom from restraint. Whereas within the classical tradition, freedom is freedom to fulfill one's end. Now, whenever I'm trying to explain this in the classroom, I use a kind of an anecdote from my own experience here. Early on, when I first got out on my own, I'm going to university and I've got my own place, and I'm trying to experiment with growing some tomato plants. I thought that would be a good idea, and I don't know anything about tomato plants. And this was a long time ago, and there wasn't YouTube. I couldn't check out what are the tricks there. So I just planted some seeds, and I thought that was the end of it. Now, for those of you who've tried to grow tomato plants, you need a stake for the tomato plant to climb up, and that tomato stake enables the tomato plant to fulfill its end. You're tying this stake rigidly, you're restraining it to this stake, and that enables it to grow to its end, produce fruit. If not, it languishes on the ground and the fruit dies. So I thought when it happened, I didn't know, and it all languished and died. I had to try again, but it made me think of this principle, and I thought it was a good example of the tomato plant needs restraint, needs limits, needs to be helped towards its end, to produce its end, in this case, the fruit of the tomato plant. Just as we all in our own lives need discipline, we need to follow certain rules, certain obligations, and that allows us within, let's say, our ethical lives to fulfill our ends. And then in aesthetics, for the classical tradition, so too a poem, a prose work is going to be better off if it follows certain principles and rules, and it will be able to fulfill its end. So the artist's job then is not to invent or spontaneously create new forms, create new conceptions of art. It's to discover and apply these laws. So this means judgment and restraint are privileged over wild wit and imagination. So the 18th century aesthetic highly valued judgment or reason, sense, restraint over mere wit, flashy verbal cleverness or imagination. So Pope champions the former as essential for true artistic achievement. And we'll turn to this quote. "'Tis more to guide than spur the muse's steed, restrain his fury than provoke his speed. The winged courser, like a generous horse, shows most true mettle when you check his course." So another example, very, very beautifully expressed by Pope, of the type of sense I was trying to get, of trying to convey earlier about true liberty and true expression needing to have the course checked somewhat like a horse. No, I'll note too the form of Pope's essay on criticism. It includes these heroic couplets. Uh, it's a verse essay on criticism, and these heroic couplets are typical of this period, and you can see the order in that, the rhyming couplets. The first line rhymed by the second. We have another line rhymed by the next. There is an order and a pattern there that is evident. It doesn't need to be searched for and scanned. We don't have to write letters next to them to figure out which lines are rhyming with which and try to recall. It is evident plainly in the speaking of it, in the looking at it on the page, one can see that rhyme. And so it's the order is so clear. So let's turn now to the great break, I would say, with the classical tradition we've been describing thus far. So we've described a tradition from Plato, Aristotle, Horace, through the Middle Ages. We looked at Augustine, Dante, and now we've looked at this neoclassical period that's turning back to the classics. And we saw Sidney quickly and Alexander Pope. That classical tradition had a certain set of classical principles that they adhered to. And what we get with beginning with Wordsworth and other romantics is a complete break when it comes to aesthetic principles with that classical tradition. It's tied to what I mentioned earlier, this second wave of modernity. So I have lectures on introduction to romanticism. I have an introduction to the second wave of modernity that I'll put in the description, as well as the introductions to the Renaissance. I mentioned introductions to 18th century literature that includes Pope. Now, Wordsworth, the Romantics, the second wave of modernity, Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads. So first of all, he along with Coleridge published Lyrical Ballads with a few other poems in 1798. And this collection of poems is quite radical in its form. And in 1800, they publish a second edition with a few additional poems, and Wordsworth adds a preface to defend, so to speak, the style of these poems, which were breaking very much with that neoclassical tradition of the 18th century. And this is really seen as the manifesto of Romantic poetry in England. So, first kind of theme I want to draw attention to in this preface to Lyrical Ballads is the self and the poet. So the Romantic poet is conceived as using his imagination. I say his because predominantly at this point conceived of as male at this point, uses his imagination to transform the world and escape from it. So imagination is godlike. Imaginative structuring of the world repeats the act of creation. Romantic criticism and thought is not concerned with the subject matter of the poem, but with the mind of the poet. Now, in our introduction to literary theory, in that lecture, we talked about these poles, the fourfold distinction of ways of thinking about the anchor of meaning of a work. So we had the mimetic pole, in what way does the work relate to the universe? The pragmatic pole, in what way does the work of literature relate to the audience? We had the objective pole, let's just look at the work itself and closely read it. And the expressive pole is the one that's really started with the Romantics, with Wordsworth. In what way is the work an expression of the mind of a poet? This was not a big concern in the whole classical tradition. Classical tradition occupied itself with the question of, starting with Plato, does the work of literature represent faithfully the world, the cosmos, truth, the mimetic pole? It was also concerned with the moral effects of poetry. To what extent is it teaching the right virtues? That's the pragmatic pole. To some extent, there was discussions of the nature of poetry, the objective pole. It's only with Wordsworth and the Romantics that this concern with the thinking about literature as an expression of an author's feelings or intention, does that come along? And in a way, we're living in I would say still, the wake of that romantic revolution. When we think of literature or art, we often, or poetry or a song, we're often thinking, oh, wow, I wonder to what extent the artist felt that emotion and was trying to express it. So this expressive whole is really a product of this romantic turn, and Wordsworth was a big part of it. Let's look at form. Lyric as a short poem expressing the thoughts of the speaker becomes the major genre for the Romantics. The lyric I is the expression and exploration of the author's self. So normally the I of a lyric poem in the classical tradition, Catullus had a poem where the I speaking is a strand of hair. Like, we're not supposed to assume that that's the author. The lyric I, the I speaking in a lyric poem, and romantic poems, on the other hand, that is almost always to be identified with the author. And in fact, Wordsworth's poems, Tintern Abbey, famously, he's reflecting on his memories of being at Tintern Abbey, and he then goes on to talk about, and now, my companion, his sister. It's evidently his sister Dorothy. This is not some fictional character. So poetry is conceived of as, for Wordsworth, quote unquote, a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. So it's not an art. It's for Pope. Remember, there's rules, there's a method. Study that. There's an art to follow. That goes back to Horace. The title of Horace's works is The Art of Poetry. This is not merely some divine madness. There's a certain part of it that is, let's say, natural ability. There's a certain part that can be inspiration, but there's an art there. Not so for Wordsworth. Blake, for instance, is in this tradition and felt and expressed the point that he also wrote from inspiration. The subject. Wordsworth says he chooses things from common life as the subject matter of his poetry, and things are rendered new. The common becomes uncommon, and with wonder, as if they were encountered for the first time. And this is the interesting thing, right? So there's a certain, say, natural supernaturalism that is expressed in the poems and lyrical ballads. So there was an agreement between Wordsworth and Coleridge, given their each of their tendencies. Wordsworth's poems take simple, common life, a woods person in the woods, a hermit in the woods, and ex- let's say this natural object, and tries to bring out the essential, the spiritual in that, the supernatural. So he goes from the natural to the supernatural, so to speak. Whereas Coleridge gives us, for instance, in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner, uh, and his poems, events that have a supernatural tinge to them. These things are not going to be happening in everyday life, but he brings them down so that they have a natural and individual feeling and power to them. It's not mere kind of myth or fairy tales. There's a certain common natural power to them. So he brings the supernatural to the natural, and Wordsworth wants to show the spiritual or the supernatural in the natural. Now, so in terms of subject matter, the classical tradition had felt, you needed to have subject matter that had a certain magnitude. We see that beginning with Aristotle. You needed figures that were above the common, so to speak. Now, um, the with the Romantics, we begin to have, let's say, a democratic turn in subject matter. So the natural world, the common world, is encountered as supernatural, as strange and inspiring, because infused with divine and infinite. And this focus on common life is, as I mentioned, a democratization of art akin to the French Revolution's political democratization. And the French Revolution had a profound effect on these romantics. William Hazlitt, a literary critic and philosopher at the time, declared that the Romantic school of Wordsworth was the literary equivalent to the French Revolution, translating political changes into poetic experiments. Quote from Hazlitt: "Kings and queens were dethroned from their rank and station in legitimate tragedy or epic poetry as they were decapitated elsewhere." So I think a very good expression of that, let's say, translation of the spirit of the French Revolution to the Romantic tradition. So to summarize where we've come in the last couple of lectures on the history of literary theory, we looked at ancient literary theory, we looked at Plato's critique of poetry in the Republic, Aristotle's reflections on poetry and the Poetics, Horace's art of poetry. In the second lecture, we looked at Augustine's On Christian Doctrine, Dante's letter to Congrande, and the fourfold interpretation he talks about there that was so prevalent in the Middle Ages. And in this last lecture, we looked at the neoclassical and romantic literary theory that basically ends the history of traditional literary theory before we get to what's often referred to as contemporary literary theory of the 20th and 21st centuries. Now, to schematize this a bit, as I like to do, just as a way of reminding ourselves, as a way of getting historical perspective, I like to put these things on timelines when possible. Sidney seems far from us. Sidney, Pope, they seem so remote. Even Wordsworth, so oldie-timey, so to speak, if I can use that expression. But these are the most close to us if we think about the tradition. So the tradition going from Plato to the present, really right up to Pope's essay, follows a continuous line in terms of thinking about art. There's big epochs there, the ancient epoch, the medieval epoch, the early modern epoch, but all of those in terms of aesthetics can be termed the classical tradition of aesthetics. Then we begin to get this shift with Wordsworth, the Romantics that go through the 19th century, and with the 20th and now into the 21st century, an acceleration to some extent of the implications of the turn in Romanticism. If we're turning from historical standards, if we're turning from having an eternal truth that can guide, let's say, literary composition and how to understand literature, we begin to get that amplified and accelerated in the 20th and 21st century, leading ultimately to a certain relativism, so to speak, that we'll see play out throughout the rest of the course. So I'll stop there, and that's our history of literary theory. The next lecture has to do with Nietzsche and contemporary literary theory. So this is really the bedrock of contemporary literary theory. I think it's all grounded in Friedrich Nietzsche, Nietzsche's philosophy, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about the Nietzschean genealogy of contemporary literary theory, how he leads to Heidegger, to the French post-structuralists, and then through them to right to the gender and race political theories that we have today. We'll look at his notion that God is dead and the history of nihilism and how that's picked up in literary theory. We'll look at his notion of the will to power and perspectivism and how that's picked up in contemporary literary theory. And then we'll look closely at his essay on truth and lying in a non-moral sense. So looking ahead for that in that lecture series of lectures, I'll probably break it up into those four parts. If you want to start reading that essay on truth and lying in an extra moral sense, you can get a head start on that for the course if you're following along. So I hope you enjoyed this and stay tuned for the next lecture on Nietzsche. Thank you very much.